In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Well, between Roseanne Barr and Samantha B., you really think that's her real last name? It has been a most entertaining week in the game of personal destruction. But it has also pointed out a most uncivilized polarization that has gripped us as a people that I would like to put in some larger context this morning. Culturally, we have come to what I consider an intolerable standoff that looks like the gunfight at the OK Corral. God kicked out of the boardroom, out of the classroom, out of the editing room. We seem to have misplaced all our standards about how we are supposed to live together in community. If some people didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all. My son said that's an old line and I shouldn't use it. So our senior warden sent me this week a link to a series of lectures by former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, on the proper context for understanding human rights. I spent our Anglican Institute leadership, Ephraim Radner and Chris Seitz, and I spent a whole day with Rowan Williams at Lambeth Palace working on communion issues, and I really liked him and respected him, and so I immediately delved into this reading, and it consumed my week. Thank you, Senior Warden, for that input. But what Archbishop Williams was working on in these lectures was developing a doctrine of living in community as God intended us to live, of being more than a community that demands and legislates entitlements from another group who resists every opportunity to share. Instead, a vision of how God intends us to live in respectful mutuality. The papers and the videos were really about the issue of entitlements and universal minimum income, which is tremendously timely and important to think about. But I'm interested this morning in applying the particular insights of Archbishop Williams to this statement of Jesus from our gospel: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath was to be a sign of the coming, not yet here, salvation intended by God. But when that salvation had come in the ministry of Jesus, the sign of what was expected had to give way to the new reality. That's why we just sang an Easter hymn, because that announces the new reality in which we live. And this new reality required a way of living together, kingdom living, in which every man's talents and every man's resources were respectfully offered and received for the mutual benefit of the whole community. Very contrary to every man for himself, survival of the fittest, which is then countered by demands for rights and entitlements from the fittest. My interest this morning is specifically to condense and quote Rowan Williams' insights about how God intends humankind, the human community, to live together in the Jesus-inaugurated kingdom common life, which is much differentiated from a prevailing and ever-escalating radical individualism that we've seen in our lifetime. Rowan Williams makes the point that living together in a community demands a mutual response instead of how we make self-serving claims on the community. In other words, everybody is about giving of what God has given them rather than some making demands on the other. He writes that this is really about human dignity and human relatedness, wherein we see all other persons created in the image of God, of having gifts given them by God to offer and be shared in the whole community, which is very much different from human rights. In fact, Rowan Williams doesn't even like the phrase human rights, because that's simply legal code that demands entitlements by some at the resentful expense of others, which sets up a negative polarity. In other words, this is about mutual recognition between human beings living together in God's creation as God's people, having empathy and identification with one another. Religion, Archbishop Williams says, contributes the doctrinal core to this underlining principle, that the nature of humanity created in God's image requires both equality and a view of rights disconnected from any political pressure and social systems, grounded instead in God's love for all his creatures, believing that every human subject is related to God. Whatever their particular circumstances, whatever political solutions may claim, they are precious in the eyes of God. Archbishop Williams writes that the fundamental point is that persons and minority groups of persons need to be recognized as belonging to the same moral and civic world as the majority, whatever differences or disagreements there may be. Where it has been commonplace to use stereotypical words and images of others, we come to see that by using such words and pictures, we are in effect treating some person or some group as people we need not to fully recognize as fellow humans and fellow citizens, people who do not belong in the same way that we do, who do not share our common dignity and worthiness. The Christian conviction, he says, is that God so loved the world, and if God so loves the world, there is a level of respect owed to human beings, irrespective of their nationality, their status, their gender, their age or achievement, even for Jesse and me who have a Canadian daughter-in-law. All persons have a status simply as members of the human race, created by God in the image and likeness of God, each having a responsibility to reflect in their own lives, every one of us, the love, faithfulness, dependability, and justice of God. Such a doctrine of human preciousness is deeply opposed to current culture's radical individualism, since it requires every person to acknowledge the same status of every other person. And what this requirement looks like is this. Every individual's account of their own needs or desires has to be thought about and negotiated in the context of their mutual recognition of everyone else, with empathy for every other person's living this life, having a sense of urgency about how all lives matter, how each person is unique and irreplaceable. And this goes both directions. How much of what we have are we really obliged to joyfully give to help others? And how much of what we don't have can we demand from others? Archbishop Williams is fond of quoting Roger Rustin's very interesting book, Human Rights and the Image of God. And Rustin writes that every human agent is potentially a free contributor to a creative social practice. Everyone. Endowed with the capacity, everyone, to make a difference to a shared social world. Each being receivers as well as givers of love. Objects of an unconditional divine love. Rustin and Williams both suggest that mutual recognition, acknowledging the dignity of every other human person, is to admit that there is something about them to which my own purposes and preferences are irrelevant, that they matter at least as much as I do. Roger Rustin proposes that being in the image of God puts the human person into a set of relationships. This is the right ordering for us of ourselves in context of the whole. Those relationships, first with God, a relationship of adoption and answerability, accountability. Second, with one another, relationships of equality and reciprocity. And third, with the non-human creature, a relationship of stewardship and freedom of use. These relationships constitute what human identity is. People who are first in relationship with God, second with one another, and thirdly with the world around them. Rustin concludes that what we recognize in recognizing the dignity of others is that their lives are significant in God's eyes. They have a standing before God, which is of its nature invulnerable to the success or failure of anything else going on in their life or any other situation in the contingent world. Well, this sermon is merely a 1,000 word glimpse into the over 20,000 words that I read of Rowan Williams this week. So my sermon is far from addressing every issue. Certainly, at least this makes me think, I hope for you to think too, of our own responsibility for the very much helpless homeless woman, for example, who has been sleeping in the church's doorway this past week. Yet it also affirms our posture toward the young pot smoker who came up this week and asked me to take responsibility for his well-being by giving him some money that he admitted he was going to use. I told him where to go get a bus ticket. He said, no, I need the money because I really want to buy pot with it. All of this is a difficult and complicated problem in our community. In fact, in our nation, involving the basic inability of people to live graciously with one another, demanding their rights as victims on one hand, with no expectation of making a contribution to others on the other, without mutual respect and commitment to a common purpose and life. So I want to suggest something in the midst of the Archbishop's fine theological reflection that we can apply to ourselves as a starting point, as a mental exercise of finding our right place in the human community, a first step to any solution that we as Christians need to model. It's something I've talked about constantly, which we've always talked about, comes from the work of Princeton theologian James Allen concerning our overextended, over-consuming, over-asserting, over-inflated human posture. That we need to think about where we stop and others begin. You ever watch Water's World? This is my world. So what I like about that is this is how far he goes. And then over here is the person he's talking to world. And so he doesn't intrude. They've got a world too. So our worlds meet. They're tangential. How much of the attention do we warrant and others deserve? How much of the world's resources and space do we require in the context of every other equally valuable creature to God? And we need to help others share in this, what I call rationing of self, to require, even demand, a level of mutual responsibility and expectation both for ourselves and for others. That's what I did with the young pot smoker. I required him to have some personal responsibility. That we have a realistic self-awareness of ourselves in the context of God's larger world. I would venture to say that everyone here has worked hard to carve out their own space and security. But I would also venture that we might want to consider theologically not just the space and security others also deserve, but also the requirement that they make a contribution to the common whole, a demand on themselves for the common good as an important part of their own feeling of self-worth, of contribution, of worthy of love. Well, I will close with a thought about my vegetarian, vegan, food-careful friends. I didn't know if I ought to add this in, but I thought I would, because it's very much on point, very much in context of community, mutual respect and consideration. I know we all cater to your dietary sensitivities, but don't you think it's time for you to throw a steak on the grill for the rest of us? Amen.